mitigate the challenges, and we particularly want to develop dialogue. So we hope to have plenty of time for people to ask questions. Tonight's program will be the second of 3 presentations by Sovaida Maani Ewing. Sovaida was born to a pioneering family in Kenya and went to school in Haifa, Israel, for several years, during which her mother served at the Baha'i World Center. She has lived in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and the United States. She's an international lawyer, an independent scholar, and the founding director of the CPGG, Center for Peace and Global Governance, cpgg.org. CPGG is a virtual think tank, an online forum that pools and proposes principled solutions to pressing global problems through publications, podcasts, lectures, workshops, webinars, and targeted consulting. And I'm glad you didn't put any more P's in that. Sovaida, that's a lot of P's in that sentence. The CPGG recently published Sovaida's book, Bridge to Global Governance, Tackling Climate Change, Energy Distribution, and Nuclear Proliferation. The book posits that while humanity's unprecedented interdependence has made it prone to systemic ailments like climate change and growing threats of nuclear terrorism and war, yet it lacks the institutions for collective decision-making and enforcement needed to tackle these challenges effectively. Sovaida has written several other books as well, and she was just telling me that she's working on a new one that she hopes will be out in the fall, which we look forward to as well. Perhaps we'll have her come and talk about that book, unless she's already exhausted the topic by then for us in various ways. Sovaida is providing 3 talks for our Global Challenges and Opportunities series on Wednesday, the 7th, 14th, and 21st of April. So this is right in the middle. Tonight is her second one, and it is titled A Principled Approach to Solving Global Challenges. This dialogue series will also be broadcast live over Facebook and our YouTube channel. So if you can't get in here, you can always go find them there. It's also going to be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel once the recording is finished. They are designed to reach a general audience, so invite your friends and colleagues to tune in as well. Before we begin, however, I should mention a few other things. Please keep yourselves safe during this current global pandemic. Stay at home, minimize your contact with people outside your immediate family, stay at least 2 meters or 6 feet from other people in public, and wash your hands frequently. With these measures, we should be able to protect as many people as possible from this illness, especially the elderly and those who have compromised immune systems. So without further delay, I now turn to Sovaida and her presentation. Thank you, Sovaida, for joining us tonight. We very much look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for that very gracious introduction. I just want to make sure before we start, is everybody who's in the waiting room, have they been let in?
Yeah, we're up to 113 people, and people can just simply pour right in now. The waiting room is open.
So welcome to this second presentation, really hopefully a dialogue in this series on global governance. For those of you who were here last Tuesday, you'll remember that we started off by talking about the importance of creating the right soil, namely the right mindset, the right way of thinking about what's going on today, including the pandemic and the global economic crisis that we're now being told is going to lead to a recession that's more severe than the Great Depression. So we've got a lot coming down the pike. And I told you then that I believe there are 3 steps we need to take in order to create a new system of global governance. In other words, a set of institutions that can meet the needs of humanity today, including resolving the huge challenges before us. The first step was creating that correct mindset, and I'm not going to repeat what I said. For those of you who missed it and are interested, please do go back and take a look at one of those videos on Facebook or YouTube. The second step, having created that mindset in which we interpret events in an optimistic light and in a more empowering, constructive light, The next step is then to look around, having this new perspective and say, okay, what now are our choices going forward? We've now decided that we don't care to be the same community that we've been until now. In other words, the who we've been, the WHO who we've been, is not the same who that we want to be going forward into the future. And this requires a new exercise of free will choice. So what are the array of choices before us, and how do we need to harness this gift of free will choice, as Viktor Frankl called it, as we discussed last time? How can we harness this gift of free will choice in order to take more constructive steps for the future? So the first way in which we harness this gift of free will choice is to look at a particular habit that we're going to explore in today's session, and we're going to go into it in some depth. It's a very dysfunctional habit that we've had. We're going to look at it and look at its underbelly, and then think about what we can replace it with. So you remember that last time we talked about the fact that when we look at humanity, we seem to be buffeted by storms of collective and successive crises. And we see it today with the pandemic, the economic crisis, climate change. I was just listening on the news to the tragic story of what's going on in East Africa right now with the locusts eating up large quantities of food in 8 East African countries. I'm going to come back to this in a second. All of these crises are increasing in number, as we just demonstrated. They're increasing in frequency and intensity. And we talked about the fact that we can either view all of these growing crises as a set of unmitigated disasters that are out of our control, or we can view them as opportunities. Now let's look and see what we've traditionally done. What has been our habitual response to any one or group of these crises? Our habitual response, as we look through the old habitual lens of, oh, woe is us, we are helpless, we're out of control, and we're angry about what's going on, and we want to find someone to blame. As we look through this, our knee-jerk reaction has been to rely on a habit that I call the habit of short-termism or expediency. So we're going to unpack what these terms essentially mean. The features of short-termism are, firstly, that it is reactive versus proactive. In other words, we look at the crisis of the day and we look at the fire that needs to be put out and say, let's just put the fire out. In fact, if you look at the actual fires that humanity's been experiencing lately, the wildfires, whether they were in California, in the Amazon, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in the forests there, or in Australia, that was the first order of business. Let's put the fires out. The goal was to put them out so they didn't spread. However, the second feature of short-termism is that it's focused on short-term benefits versus long-term benefits. So as we went about putting out the wildfires, let's say in Australia, to focus on one example, we weren't actually concerned with reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, polluting the air, resulting in global warming, which in turn had caused droughts and turned the landscape into a tinderbox that made it then susceptible to these uncontrollable wildfires. We were focused on the short-term benefits of just putting the fires out so that we could avoid destruction of property, of human lives, and of animals and plant species. The third feature of short-termism is that it considers only narrowly conceived self-interest as opposed to broader common interests, namely the interests of an interconnected humanity. So going back to our wildfire example, it's clear that countries have still not been willing to adopt a set of universal and binding rules to arrest climate change so that it doesn't trigger the series of crises that's going on. Okay. Now, so we've talked about what short-termism is, and we've said that this has been the traditional way of responding to any given global crisis. What are the consequences of short-termism? In other words, why is it so bad? So what? So we get to put the fire out. What's the big deal? Okay, let's look at a number of problems. The first is because it's a reactive approach, we don't actually get to sit back and think a problem through and think about the array of choices we have because we simply don't have the time. We don't have the time to ponder the choices. We don't have the time to put them in place. Let's take a perfect example, COVID-19. Our response to it has been a perfect example of reacting to a crisis after it's happened. Had we heeded the many warnings that have been issued since really 2003 in particular about the risks of a global pandemic, with estimates given of the millions that would die as a result and the impact it would have on the economy, we were given warnings, but we chose not to heed them. Had we heeded them, we would not now have to take drastic actions like shutting down economies all over the world in order to buy time to play catch up, in order to get ourselves equipped with masks, ventilators, hospital beds, vaccines, antidotes, and to avoid having our health systems crash. And I'm talking on, this is a global phenomenon. I'm not saying that this is a problem in any given country. This has been really a global shortcoming that we have had. We abdicated responsibility essentially as an international community. We could have put in an early warning system. We could have given the WHO the authority it needed to properly coordinate a global response and issue binding decisions that would be binding on all nations. And on and on. So there were all these opportunities that were missed because of this knee-jerk habit of short-termism. We'll deal with the problem when it arises. Let's not think about potential future disasters now. The second problem with expediency or short-termism is that it never solves any problem at root. And so what happens is whichever problem we end up tackling or thinking we've tackled ends up coming back, but in more intensified form. So we're all familiar with the spate of genocides we've had around the world. And every time one has happened, we've said, like beginning with the one in Rwanda, we said never again. And then we saw the genocides in Europe, in Serbia, we saw them in Albania, Darfur. Each time the genocide recurs and it is worse than it was before. Nuclear proliferation is another example of a global challenge that keeps coming back. We thought we dealt with Saddam Hussein's nuclear program, then we discovered that Libya had an illicit nuclear program. North Korea came out and said, hey, guess what? We've had an illegal nuclear program. We've been trying collectively as an international community to deal with Iran's secret nuclear weapon program. There was Syria's, and on and on and on. We've not been able to resolve these. So the problems have never been solved at their root, despite, for instance, the fact that we entered into a Gulf War in order to resolve this very problem, supposedly. The third problem is that our solution to one disaster often sows the seeds of the next disaster. So just to take a simple historical example, a number of countries were worried, particularly Western countries, that the Soviets had gone into Afghanistan. This is a matter of historical record. So what did we do? We trained and armed fighters and provided arms to go into Afghanistan and dislodge the Soviets. We were very successful in that short-term goal that was perceived to be in certain narrowly conceived national interests. However, by doing that, we created a bigger problem, the Taliban. And then we had to go in and engage in another war to try and dislodge the Taliban. And we know how that's ended up. We're still mired in a very unstable situation in a country that still really hasn't known proper peace. And its people are certainly not thriving. The third consequence of expediency is, well, we just examined the third, sorry. The fourth problem is that solutions that we craft to different global crises are incongruent with each other. And the solution in one area often ends up undermining solutions in other areas. So, for example, we claim to be as concerned about making sure that the energy needs of all countries and peoples are met so that they can thrive. And we also say that we are very interested in promoting human rights. But when push comes to shove, we're often willing to sacrifice or turn a blind eye to human rights violations of a country so long as we can secure access to energy resources. To give a concrete example, this is exactly what happened during the genocide in Darfur, where the majority of the Security Council of the United Nations was willing to pass a resolution asking for sanctions against the Sudanese government. And China, a member of the Security Council with veto power, stepped in and said, hey, if you guys bring it to a vote, we'll just have to tell you up front that we will veto it. Why? Because China, who understandably needs a lot of energy in order to fuel its economic growth, had locked up a lot of oil resources and gotten a lot of concessions, oil concessions in Sudan, and didn't want those to be disturbed. So she was definitely not going to vote in favor of sanctions. And we've seen this by all countries do this across the board. We see this with respect to countries who develop nuclear weapons, and we turn a blind eye to them if we like them. If we don't like them, we impose harsh sanctions. We do that with countries who support terrorism, but or they violate human rights, but we need their help in the fight against terrorism, so we turn a blind eye to those human rights violations. So this is something that all countries, by and large, are guilty of doing. And my goal in saying this is not to point a finger at what any one or other nation is doing, but to give one or two examples, because that's all we have time for, of this knee-jerk habit that we have. This old habit, this reaction of coming up with short-term responses to global challenges. Now, there is one example that basically summarizes this whole constellation of problems, and I'll share it with you because it's an example. When I read about it, it really struck me very forcefully. So we're talking about the country of Ecuador here. A little while ago, a couple of years ago, Ecuador decided that she really wanted to lift her people out of their plight. There's a lot of poverty in Ecuador, and there's a lot of energy need. And so Ecuador thought and said, okay, the best way to address both of these is to build a dam that will generate electricity, will sell the electricity, it will make money, it will, first of all, give our people the energy they need in order to develop economically and socially. And then the next thing that'll happen is that we'll invest the proceeds of all these monies and raise our people out of poverty. So a very noble goal. They went to another country, to China, to borrow money. Unfortunately, both countries were so eager to sign off on the deal that they only thought short term about the immediate thing that they wanted to achieve, for China to get the deal and for Ecuador to quickly lift her people out of poverty and get them the energy they needed. So they didn't think far ahead enough, and they didn't think proactively. And they built this dam really quickly. Well, within 2 years of the dam being built, 7,000 cracks had already appeared in the machinery. To add to that, the reservoir became filled with silt and bushes and trees of various kinds, essentially rendering the dam very inefficient, close to useless. As a result, Ecuador didn't make the money that I thought that it would be able to make and was not able to repay the loans it had taken from China. What ended up happening at the end of the day was that China then was given access to 80% of Ecuador's most important export, which is oil. And so here we are now with Ecuador still having her people in dire poverty, still not having access to the energy needs they have, and losing the proceeds from 80% of the income derived from the sale of oil. So this is a classic example of countries really not taking the time to think proactively. Why? Again, because this is the habit we've had. We all know what habits are like. We each have them in our individual lives, and we often do things unthinkingly. That's the problem with habits. That's why one needs to step back and look at habits. And this is one of the opportunities that COVID-19, despite all the horrific suffering it's causing, it is giving us the opportunity to step back and say, okay, wait a minute. What have the habits been that have been part of our undoing? And what can we do to change them so we will never have to go through this kind of pain and suffering again? There are two more consequences I want to quickly look at. One is that this habit of expediency fails to take a really important fact into account, and that is the fact that our global problems have now become very interconnected. We no longer live in a time where we can say, oh, we'll just take one problem, let's say the genocide in Syria, and just focus on that. We have to tackle all the problems. Because did you know that it's fascinating? I didn't know this until I started reading some studies. They now believe that the uprisings in Syria that triggered the civil war were caused as a result of several years of drought in Syria, which in turn were triggered by climate change. So you've got climate change leads to drought, leads to uprising, leads to the leader of the country trying to stamp the uprising down, using chemical weapons, causing a civil war, causing then the migration crisis, the refugee crisis, which had knock-on effects in Europe, where people became more xenophobic and nationalistic, and it was also a trigger for Brexit, and created the fertile soil in Syria for ISIL to grow and develop. So you see, one global crisis can spawn a whole series of other global crises. And the last consequence of expediency is that it undermines faith in our international institutions and our national governments. We don't believe that they can solve problems adequately. It undermines their credibility, and that's not good for any of us. We need to be able to trust our governments. Again, look at what's happening with COVID-19 in a number of countries where people don't believe what their leaders are telling them. And that can be really dangerous, because when they tell us to engage in social distancing and wear masks, if we start to doubt them, then we're all in trouble. All right, so having recognized that this habit is no longer serving us, it's an outworn one. This is the first step. We need to acknowledge that this habit of short-termism no longer serves us. There is a lovely passage in the Baha'i writings in which Shoghi Effendi talks about the fact that in a world where the one thing we can all bank on is change, it makes no sense for us to sacrifice our well-being as human beings in order to uphold institutions, laws, policies. He emphasizes the fact, and this is when you think about it, it's completely commonsensical, but we don't often stop to think about it. Laws, policies, institutions are there for what reason? To serve us, to serve our happiness and our well-being. It makes no sense for us to sacrifice ourselves just to uphold a particular tradition or a particular document if its time has come and gone. So having acknowledged that this habit that we've been quite attached to no longer serves us, the next question is, can we choose an alternative habit that is more effective, constructive, and empowering? Now, we talked about mindset last time, and we said that once we have that, as long as we have the old mindset that we are essentially helpless and there's always going to be somebody we can be angry at and to blame for our problems, as long as we had that old mindset, we also had that old habit of short-termism. Well, imagine now adopting a new mindset that goes like this, a new interpretation of what's going on in our world. And here's the interpretation. It goes like this. It says, if we look at the history of the evolution of humanity, we see that humanity's been evolving just as an individual would through various stages of growth: infancy, toddlerhood, childhood, being young youth, and then youth, and then finally maturity, adolescence and maturity. If we think of our growth in this way, we will recognize that the current phase of humanity that we're in is the phase of a very turbulent adolescence in which we're all acting out. If we understand that that's all that's happening, it's not that we're just bad by nature, that we're always going to be warlike and we're never going to change. Because what does that attitude do? We're never going to even want to try, and we're going to get so depressed and hopeless. Instead, we say, as all of us who've been teenagers or have had teenagers know, hey, look, this is a phase they're going through. We're not going to throw them out of the house and give up on them. We're going to be encouraging and loving and compassionate and wait until they grow out of this phase with plenty of encouragement and guidance in the meantime. Well, we need to develop that same attitude with respect to ourselves as a collective humanity. So what can that alternative habit be that replaces short-termism as we adopt this new mindset that we're simply just going through a really rocky, turbulent adolescence? So yes, there is a new habit, and the habit that I propose, and this is work I've been doing for the last 20 years, really kind of beating the drum on this one because I think it's so important, and you'll see why. The habit of applying a principled solution to solving global challenges, a principled approach to replace a short-termist or expedient approach to solving global challenges. So let's first look at what do you mean, Sovaida, when you say a principled approach? What does that mean? Well, essentially, I've got here a 3-step process. It's actually, there's a 4th step that relates to the presentation next week, but I've jotted it down. But the first 3 important steps are this. As a global community, we need to identify a set of shared foundational principles, or what has come to be known as global ethics. Second thing to do is get the leaders of our nations to agree on this shared set of global ethics. The third is to get them to commit to applying them methodically and uncompromisingly to solving any global challenges. And then the fourth, which we'll talk about more next Tuesday night, is weaving these principles into the very fabric of a new infrastructure of global governance. In other words, collective decision-making and enforcement institutions that we need to tackle our collective problems. Okay, I hear all the skeptical questions in your head, and I'm going to try and address them in a second. But first, let me say this. The good news is that I'm not the only crazy person on this planet talking about this. There are a growing number of voices, and eminent voices, people who are known for being able to think, in support of this approach. I've listed some of them here. Last time we introduced Professor Kishore Mahbubani of Singapore, former Singaporean permanent representative to the UN, and later Dean of the School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. And we talked about the beautiful analogy that he gave us of the ship, of humanity being like a ship with 193 cabins, each representing a nation. And in this analogy, he expands on it and says each of the cabins has its own set of rules to govern it. The problem is that the rules applied within one cabin can easily cause the entire ship to be scuttled. And so we simply can't afford to let nations do whatever they want in all spheres. In many spheres, yes, but in some not. And guess what? We're learning this lesson right now with COVID-19. We know that our ability as a global community to tackle the pandemic is only as good as our weakest link. So if we have nations, and the Europeans are finding this out the hard way, if one nation in Europe says, we don't need social distancing, we don't need masks, we can keep our restaurants and bars open, as some try to do, it has a domino effect on all the other countries in Europe because we're so interconnected. We no longer live in silos. We're not independent boats bobbing on the ocean of international life. In 1985, the Universal House of Justice, which is the governing body of the Baha'i Faith, issued a statement addressed to the peoples of the world. The peace statement, it's called the Promise of World Peace. In it, they said leaders of governments and all in authority would be well served in their efforts to solve problems if they would first seek to identify the principles involved and be guided by them. Not long after that, Gareth Evans, former Foreign Minister of Australia and the President and CEO of the International Crisis Group, said this in a talk he gave, in an article he wrote. He said, there is no substitute for going back to first principles, getting consensus around them, which was our step 2, and then applying them, which was our step 3. And then he continued and said, regrettably, none of the above is normal government practice domestically, i.e. within nations, or internationally. Pascal Lamy, former director of the World Trade Organization, has talked about this many times. And he says something like this: the ability to address today's global challenges is undermined by the absence of a collective vision for society. We urge leaders to establish what? Shared global values to protect the prospects for future generations. There are many others, Professor Golden of Oxford, Thierry Breton, who gave a wonderful interview just a couple of days ago to France 24, and Professor Michael Sandel of Harvard, who teaches political philosophy, who's already trying to get us to think about what, not when we're going to open up for business, but what kind of world we're going to live in, what kind of economy will emerge from the crisis, because this is an opportunity we have to shape a different kind of world rather than go back to business as usual and start doing the same old things, engaging in the same old habits that got us into this hot water to begin with. Here's what he says: we need to ask whether reopening the economy means going back to a system that over the past 4 decades pulled us apart, or whether we can emerge from this crisis with an economy that enables us to say and to believe that we are all in this together. Okay, now to address some of the questions that inevitably come up every time I talk about this. Who gets to determine what the set of global ethics or foundational principles should be? So here is what I propose. And again, a lot of my thinking is inspired by the Baha'i writings, and then I try to build on it. So we begin with a handful of trustworthy and distinguished leaders whose only objective is peace, the peace and security of humanity. In other words, they're not doing backroom deals saying, well, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You give me this, I'll give you something else. They're all there for the collective good of humanity. And note the importance of trustworthy and distinguished. Well, we're not going to get trustworthy and distinguished leaders until we, the peoples of the world, get smart about the way we go about electing our leaders. We're going to get the leaders we deserve. In other words, if we don't pay attention and don't pay attention to qualities of character that should actually be paramount, it's no big surprise that we're not going to get the kinds of leaders we need who have the sense of responsibility necessary and the courage and the moral courage to make the decisions we need to tackle our global challenges. That is a whole nother topic that we can actually have another session on at some point. So having this small group of leaders come up with what they propose as a set of global ethics, the second step is for them to agree on it and then to go out and seek the agreement of the remaining leaders and governments of the world. Now, at this point, I'm imagining you, because I can't see any of you, all scratching your heads thinking, boy, what did she have for dinner tonight? Because this is never going to happen. Well, folks, and here's your question, is this really possible or is it a pipe dream? Well, guess what? It's been done before in the very recent past. It was the world's experiment with the development of a new norm in international relations, a new, what is now considered a principle, some believe, of international law. And the principle you may have heard of, responsibility to protect, or affectionately known as R2P. So let's take a quick look at what happened here. So in the year 2001, the government of Canada, God bless them, created a commission to look at the question of sovereignty, which really lies at the heart of all this conversation that we're having over these 3 sessions, because global governance requires nations to understand that they no longer have unfettered national sovereignty, not in today's interconnected world. So they established a commission to see how they could reframe, which is what we've been talking about doing, this whole notion of sovereignty. And they came up with a very clever way of reframing it. So what had happened is that until then, whenever people heard the word sovereignty, especially whenever national leaders heard it, they immediately thought, my right not to have you intervene in my country, butt out. And they said, let's not talk about rights and let's not talk about intervention. Let's talk in terms of responsibility. Isn't it true, they posited, that the reason why nation states were set up was so that they would be responsible for the welfare of their people? And isn't this what it's all about? And then they said, and our second question is, if that's so, then what happens when a nation or a government finds itself either unable or unwilling to do what it takes to protect its people? Don't its people still deserve to be protected? If so, who is to step in and take over that responsibility? You wouldn't want your neighbor country stepping in, right? Because you're worried that they'll come and take over. So how about the international community has not just the right, but the responsibility to step in and make sure that the welfare of the people of your country is ensured? So these were the concepts. And what they did was the people on the team of this commission went and traveled around the world over a period of 2 years, only 2 years. They visited every country, talked to every head of state and key cabinet ministers. And they asked them these questions. I heard one of them give a talk here in Washington, D.C., And he said that they were frankly stunned that the response they got in every single one of their conversations was so positive. He said, we were sure when we went in to talk to some leaders and we asked them, do you think that you have absolute sovereignty within your country? That some of them would say, yes, of course. And he said, no one did. They all said, we're fully aware that in today's world, there is no such thing as absolute sovereignty. And then they went through all these questions with them, building block by building block. Well, the result of this process that these folks went through was that 4 years and a bit after the commission was set up, it was set up in 2001, in September 2005, when all the leaders of the nations met at the World Summit, which many of you will remember in New York City in 2005, we were all excited about it because this was the beginning of a new century. And we were looking to see what these world leaders would come up with, right? Well, they disappointed us on many fronts, but not on this front. Unbelievably, the leaders of 193 nations agreed to sign on to the principle of the responsibility to protect. That's a phenomenal achievement. Now, I'm not saying that just signing off on a principle means that it comes into that people apply it immediately. No, we are still struggling with it, but at least psychologically, the norm is in our minds. Think about our individual lives. I want to lose weight. I make the decision, but by the time I actually am successful, it takes a number of tries, often a number of years, often having a serious illness or something terrible happen to act as a catalyst for us to actually take the steps. But that's the nature of habits. So I wanted to give you hope and optimism that this program is not a crazy program. It is possible. It has been done. And then the third inevitable question is, so what principles should be included? Well, the first most important principle, and these are ones I'm suggesting, again, based on my read of what the international community needs and inspired by many various writers and thinkers, including, of course, the Baha'i writings. So the first principle is the principle of the oneness of humanity and of nations. This should become the operational principle of international life. It should be the central, pivotal principle. It is the reason we have all the problems we have in the world today is because the leaders of all of our countries and of our international institutions have failed to read correctly the sign of the times that we are one as people, and acknowledge this principle and adjust their machinery of institutions, government, sure that this principle is at the very foundation, that it's a premise upon which the global infrastructure and our national infrastructure is built. Let's take a simple example of what it would look like if we were to imagine constructing a new system of international relations where you assume that we're all one. We would never have a debate about whether there should be right of veto on the Security Council, because it's impossible to say to nations, we really respect you and respect your views, but you know what? There are 5 nations that have veto power, and we're just so sorry. We don't believe it's in our national interest to do X, which 192 other nations may believe will bring world peace. But we're going to exercise the right of veto. In a world where we have as a premise our oneness, that would never happen. And we wouldn't need to be writing thousands of articles about whether we should eliminate the veto power of the Security Council or not. And if so, whether we should do it in a phased way, or there's so many thousands of suggestions. So much time and energy is wasted with no conclusion yet. All right, second principle is the principle of equity and justice. What does it mean? It means that we need to have an international system that is not based on fuzzy policies of, oh, I like this nation, so we'll let it do this. It has to be a rule-based system. The rules have to be agreed on in advance by all nations or based on a majority vote. And the consequences of breaking those rules should also be articulated, and every nation should be on notice. It means that when the rules are broken, they're applied even-handedly. There is no preferential treatment. So when the rules on nuclear non-proliferation are broken, it shouldn't matter if we like the country and trust them or we don't like them. The consequences should be the same. We can't live in the kind of world we live in today where some nations get a pass and other nations who've had illegal nuclear weapon programs have sanctions imposed on them or are given a hard time. It's one rule for all. Otherwise, you just hand nations an excuse to misbehave because they say, hey, you don't like us anyway. When we do the same thing another nation does, you slap our wrist, but you don't slap theirs. So basically, we might as well just act with impunity and do whatever we want. And we don't want to do that. It also means that when we evaluate crises, we evaluate them equally. A genocide in Africa should be as important to us as a genocide that takes place in Europe or in our own backyards. The third principle is the principle of collective security, which again means, and this is one of the most revolutionary principles that Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, brought in the 19th century in Iran, of all places. We don't associate Iran today with these kinds of amazing, forward-thinking international principles. Baha'u'llah said essentially that we should, the international community should get together and decide on the amount of arms that each nation would have and limited to the amount necessary to maintain order within its borders. Anything in excess would have to be destroyed for the safety of the planet. And beyond that, the international community, our leaders would need to decide, enter into agreement that said if any one nation breaches this rule, all nations agree in advance to arise and stand up to it, using, if necessary, an international standing force that we'll talk about next Tuesday. And this is an amazing principle that we absolutely need today. So this is the third principle I advocate be included. The fourth principle is that force be used only collectively and in service of justice. We are not mature enough as an international community to do without force yet. I'll unpack this a little bit more next week, but suffice it to say that there are times when, again, from the Baha'i writings, war can be the very basis of peace and ruin the very means of reconstruction. Those are the words of Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah. All right, the last principle is a recognition that unfettered national sovereignty has to be curtailed. And essentially, this principle, number 5, is linked to number 1 on the oneness of humanity. And the thing that links them is this: if we truly believe in the oneness of humanity, then we understand that the advantage of any one nation, in other words, the part of the whole, can only be guaranteed by guaranteeing the advantage or the good of the whole. So no one nation can guarantee its me first status and well-being unless it guarantees the we all first status of the entire planet. Again, COVID-19 and the current economic crisis that is only going to balloon is going to force us to learn this. And if we do not learn this lesson, we are simply going to suffer so much until we do. It seems that this is the time has come. And so it's exciting that we get this opportunity to learn this lesson. All right. On this last point, I just want to be clear that while unfettered national sovereignty must be curtailed, we're not talking about eliminating nation states. Nation states are very important for several reasons. They ensure that we avoid the excesses of centralization. We're seeing this played out in the United States right now with the debate between the governors of states and the President of the United States. If we didn't have strong state rights, we would get swallowed up very quickly. So it's important to have, to avoid excessive centralization. We need to have the buck stop somewhere. Somebody be responsible for the welfare of the citizens, and each national government is that. And to encourage diversity, which is so important, the diversity of culture, of language, of tradition, of song, of dress, of costume, etc. All right. Now I want to, I'm close to ending. This is the last big idea I have, and it's a really important one. Why is a principled approach the right way to go? Because it honors an undeniable truth that just as in our physical life, there are physical laws that govern nature, like the law of gravity, so too in our social lives, there are social laws that govern our social reality. Now, we can choose to ignore laws. I can choose to try and build an airplane and say, I want to ignore the law of gravity. Well, that's not going to go very well for me because it's going to be an unmitigated disaster. It's going to crash and it's going to cause a lot of deaths. Similarly, if we continue to ignore the law of our social existence, that we are all one, we are going to suffer more. It is no wonder that our institutions, social, economic, financial, environmental, religious, you name it, political, are all crumbling around us because we have built these social institutions without taking into account a truly fundamental principle of our social reality, that we are all one, especially at this time in human history when we are so interconnected in unprecedented ways. So it's really time that we got with the program. I'm not going to go through again the benefits of finding principled solutions to global challenges as a new habit to replace the outworn and dysfunctional habit of short-termism. We've discussed them before. And I did want to, this last slide, a number of you reached out to me individually between last week and this week, and you asked me a couple of questions. One was, which of your books contains information that is relevant to your presentations? So there are two books in particular. If I had to say, read one first, I would say number 2, Building a World Federation, the Key to Resolving Our Global Crises. It's short, it's to the point, it covers the issue of principles, and it actually covers what we're going to discuss next week in our third discussion. It's been extremely popular, especially with young people, young professionals, really from age 18 to 35. They really get it and resonate with it. The other book is Collective Security Within Reach. Both books are available on Amazon. You can get them in digital and paperback versions, especially the second. And the last thing is my blog. For those of you who are interested, I cover a number of these topics, and I basically push out weekly blogs. I would invite you to visit the blog, and the address is down below, collectivesecurity.blogspot.com. And in fact, I wrote a piece this week on the very topic that we are discussing today. So check it out, and you can also connect to me through the website of the Center for Peace and Global Governance that's also on this slide. You asked about that as well, www.cpgg.org. So thank you very much. I'm done.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sovaida. I was wondering where you were going to go with the approach other than the short term. And when you said principled, I said, oh, yes, of course. This is the way it's always supposed to be. This is how everything needs to be organized, is based on principles. People's behaviors should be based on ethical principles. So this is, of course, quite a reasonable response and quite, in a way, expected. But I think you're right that it's not at all common to people, unfortunately. Someone was just asking for the blog address again.
It's on this slide at the bottom,
right
number 3 on this slide.
And I should mention to people, if they want to change the way their screen looks, they can switch back and forth between speaker view and what's the other one called? Speaker view.
Gallery view.
And gallery view shows 2 of us. Speaker view will just show who's speaking. You can also put your cursor on the little line between the slide and the pictures and move it back and forth to make the pictures bigger or smaller, or make the slide bigger or smaller, depending on what you want to do. We do have a couple of questions already. Okay. This one is, I think, quite interesting, and in some ways easy to answer. In some ways, it's a very common question. You mentioned being proactive and provided the example of COVID-19 and giving the World Health Organization the authority to make binding decisions globally. In January 2020, the World Health Organization announced travel restrictions on the Chinese people. The Chinese government spoke out in protest to the WHO, and World Health Organization softened their stance as requested by China. Why would we give the WHO this power when they were influenced in this way?
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question. Before we give any global, before we A, create any global institutions, B, give them any power, we have to make sure that the principles we talk to are baked into the very infrastructure of those institutions. In other words, who sits on those institutions? How are they elected? Are they elected or are they appointed? Whom do they represent? Are they, and these are all topics we're going to address next week. Are they elected directly by the people of the world? Are they appointed in backroom deals? These are really critical because right now, very few of us have trust in many of our international institutions by virtue of the fact that how people get to sit on them is not transparent, that we don't have a voice in it, that we don't get to pick and choose. And then secondly, we're not sure about what their motivations are and what their agendas are and who do they favor? Do they favor one country or another? So you're absolutely right. Given the way the WHO is currently structured, we probably need to reform it before and then give it some kind of binding authority to bind countries. So no, excellent point. All of these are critical steps and they all build on each other. We can't just look at one thing and execute on it without executing on a number of other fronts as well.
Yeah, I think we also have to recognize that whenever we give any institution authority, it's going to do things we don't like, and it's going to do things we don't consider just, probably legitimately so in some cases, but that doesn't mean we should get rid of that institution. Congress and the presidency both have very low acceptance or popularity ratings right now in this country. And that doesn't mean you abolish the presidency. It doesn't mean you abolish the Congress. You have what you've got, and you know the alternatives are worse. And this is the other thing I think we have to remember is that without some sort of international structure, we have international chaos. And a certain amount of structure should greatly reduce that chaos, ensure that it's going to do things we don't like. And sometimes the things it did that we don't like are going to be problems. But nevertheless, we won't have the chaos, and maybe the system will continue to improve. It's not going to become perfect immediately. It has to develop. Some more question and answer here. You mentioned the R2P, the responsibility to protect, and the committee members of the commission that travel around the world to meet with world governments. Who paid for the committee?
I think it was the Canadian government. They set up, they were the ones who created this commission. So I don't know, but I believe it was the Canadian government. It was a true act of service as far as I'm concerned. So, and the members of the commission were from all around the world.
Oh, that's interesting.
Gareth Evans, for instance, the Australian that I mentioned, he served on that commission.
So it was an international body in that sense, in terms of the membership,
Yeah.
sponsored by the Canadian government. And someone raised their hand. I should point out that we don't really know what to do with raising hands. It usually means we could turn on microphones and cameras, but we don't do that. So if you have a question, please put it in the question and answer field or in the chat. You'll find those particular choices down on the bottom of your screen if you move your cursor around. Where does economics fall in your principled approach?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The principles apply in the field of economics as well. So perhaps you'd care to unpack the question.
Presumably that also refers to the whole issue of international coordination of economies. Mm-hmm. That would also require a principled approach. And some of that was discussed by our web talk on Sunday. The idea of a minimum international corporate tax, for example, was mentioned as one example of international rule that could help coordinate economies and also reduce the tendency of multinational corporations to go find a place where they don't have to pay taxes.
But, you know, sort of going a little bit more meta than that, which is a very specific reform suggestion, you know, after the global crisis of 2008, a number of very well-known and well-regarded economists, including, I always forget his name, the guy at Harvard. Anyway, they talked about what they believed were some of the fundamental reasons for the global crisis. And what I found fascinating was they didn't engage in economics as such, even though they were economics experts. One of them talked about the fact that it was the fact that leaders and people, regulators, stuck their head in the sand, even though they could see the problems accumulating, and they did not move fast enough. That was one. And so they said that one of the habits we need to adopt is that of owning up when the system is starting to fail, to own up to it quickly and take steps. Famously, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg at the time said, it's not that we in the Eurozone don't know how to resolve the sovereign debt crisis, it's that we don't know how to get ourselves elected once we've taken those steps. Yeah. So again, he pointed to a key problem here, which is it's all about the politicians and their ego and their chances of re-election. It was short-termism again. They were thinking in terms of 4 or 5 year cycles. Oh, let's see if I can just get myself re-elected. They were not thinking long-term. Another one of these economists talked about the importance of convergence. Malak Brown, I believe was his name, a British fellow. And he actually was part of the cabinet in the UK when this happened. And he said, we have known for a long time that we need to collaborate, coordinate, converge, and come up with shared financial regulations. And we have failed to do it. Another one said it is more about oversight. We need to have a central body that oversees financial regulation across the world. It can't be each nation or each central bank does its own thing. So all of this, I have a whole section on this, chapter on this in Building a World Federation, and that book number 2 on this slide. If you're interested, those of you who are interested in the financial and economic aspects of global challenges.
Here's a question about a chicken or egg subject. Which comes first? Understanding the oneness of humanity or getting rid of unfettered national sovereignty?
You're not going to, so again, this is my view. You're not going to logically be able to convince somebody to get rid of unfettered national sovereignty unless they understand our interconnectedness and our oneness. Once you get the oneness thing sorted out, people will very quickly recognize. That's why I said from oneness, you go to the notion that the advantage of the part can only be guaranteed by the advantage of the whole. And once you've gotten there, the next step is, and therefore, no one nation can have unfettered sovereignty. There are going to be areas of global challenge, like climate change, where no one country can solve it on its own, where we have to collaborate, where there has to be collective decision-making, where there has to be collective enforcement, and yet we're lacking those collective decision-making and enforcement institutions. And the only way that nations will allow those to exist is by being willing to cede a small part of their sovereignty, back to the word sovereignty, to this international organization, exactly the way they did in Europe. Jean Monnet did in Europe when he created the European Coal and Steel Community. So that's how I think it goes, the order in which I think it goes.
Do you want, one person asked about the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and these, of course, are a principled approach to world problems as well. Could you comment on them?
Yes, the SDGs. So when I think of the kinds of principles that we were talking about here, they're quite sort of, again, at a deeper, at the roots level. Once you accept these principles, it's much easier to get buy-in to the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals are really essentially outgrowths of an understanding that we are one, that we need equity, that they're really justice-driven to a large extent in many different spheres. So it's not an either-or, that's a false dichotomy. I think that once people are convinced of these principles at a meta level, they really imbibe them and accept them heart, mind, and spirit, then we will find that we will get to our SDG goals a lot faster.
You might want to say a little something about the Sustainable Development Goals and how they were established and their role in the international arena, and how long ago was there for 2030, the year 2030?
Oh gosh, frankly, I'm not that much of an expert. If Jeffrey is online, then I would cede the territory to him, and maybe he could type something in the chat.
Or someone else.
Or you could promote him to come on and share with us.
Right, there may be someone who can answer that question, because that's another question that people asked here about the Sustainable Development Goals. And weren't they basically agreed upon by all members of the UN as examples of global principles? And I think that's sort of true.
As goals, I'm not sure I would call them principles per se. They're goals, Sustainable Development Goals.
One person asked, how much pull does the responsibility to protect have, if any? Do these countries who participated in and agreed to take action to promote its 4 key concerns, are they actually somehow bound to them?
It's not a rule of international law. So international law is created in interesting ways. It's either created by treaty, in other words, by contract between nations agreement, or by custom, which means that a nation starts behaving a certain way, and over time, many other nations start to behave in the same way. It becomes a norm, and the question is, have enough nations been following this norm for a long enough period of time for it to be considered another source of international law? Right now, some people argue that it is a developing norm or rule of international law. I think of it as a principle more than as a law. It's important. It hasn't yet, unfortunately. It's probably in some sense a rhetorical question. Nations have not been good about abiding by it, but which is why I said we know how difficult it is to kick a habit, right? The first step is recognizing that something doesn't work. The second step is to think of a replacement habit, but then it takes a pretty long time to put that new habit in place. The problem is that if we make that the excuse not to come up with consensus around a set of shared global ethics, we are going to go through a lot more suffering only to have to start 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now. So let us begin the process now so that we can mitigate the suffering that is coming.
It seems to me it's sort of like a step beyond the post-World War II recognition of basic human rights and genocide being a violation of that. They created courts to put Nazi war criminals on trial, which is not something that you could have done 10 or 15 years earlier. You didn't have the international legal foundation for it.
Right. And now, of course, we have treaties that govern genocide and other violations of international law. Yeah. So you start in one place and it evolves.
Yeah, bit by bit. Leslie says it's the SDG platform is 2015 to 2030. So thank you, Leslie, for that clarification. Someone else asked about the Millennium Development Goals or the Millennium Goals and how do they fit in?
Again, these are all goals. So we're conflating goals and principles. So principles are really just a handful. You start with a small handful of basic principles, and you can see from the principles that were articulated that they're really foundational. I mean, the idea that we're one. Once we're one, once we accept that we want to be treated not just as individuals, but as nations like each other, then so many things flow from it. Then we want to make sure that everybody's literate. We want to make sure everybody has access to a certain modicum of education. We want to make sure that people are raised out of poverty and everybody has a baseline of subsistence for their existence, that their human honor and dignity is preserved. We want to make sure that we all have access, that we live in communities that are safe and secure, free of war, that we're free of racism, that we're free of gender prejudice, and then each of these then spawns a whole new set of goals, very specific goals. By this year, we want to make sure that X number of people have risen out of poverty, and it's going to be measured in these ways. So all of these other goals, the MDGs, the SDGs, they're all goals, but really to get people motivated to, we all set goals in life, but we all know that we set goals or New Year's resolutions and we get to November and we realize, oh, gee whiz, I still haven't fulfilled my goal. It wasn't that we didn't have goals, it's that the motivation, the will was lacking, what we call political will. So what is it that is I'm interested in igniting that political will. I believe that political will be ignited on the basis of a far deeper understanding than a set of 10, 20, 30, 40 goals that you're outlined, because people look at those goals and it just looks like a list to them. Mm-hmm. If they don't have emotional and spiritual buy-in, because they recognize that these goals are tangible ways of demonstrating that we believe in the oneness of humanity, then they're going to drag their heels.
Yeah. And Leslie also responded about the Millennium Development Goals and said they were the goals from 2000 to 2015, and they were then followed by the Sustainable Development Goals 2015 to 2030. So that they were the predecessor goals of the SDGs. Mm-hmm. One person asked this sort of interesting question, and I'm wasn't sure whether to ask this or not, and that's that. What do you think the principles and virtues cannot be obtained from simple talk or even logic? What role is acceptance of God and acceptance of divine teachings going to play in establishment of these this new world structure?
Okay. All right. Well, the acceptance of divine teachings may well accelerate it, but I don't think that one has to be a believer in a God or in a particular religion in order to truly believe in the concept of the oneness of humanity. And I'm going to be really blunt here. We don't have the luxury of time to wait for all the people of the world or majority to have some aha moment in which they say, gosh, there is a force, a power greater than me. Our world is, look at the COVID-19 crisis. We are going to have to create a system of global governance. And by the way, the Baha'i writings envision this very clearly, that there will be stages in the development of global governance, and we will have to establish some kind of limited form of world government in the short term, because we have to. Circumstances are going to force us to, in order to tackle things like pandemics, like the potential for nuclear holocaust, like a global financial meltdown. We can't wait for people to be spiritually transformed and have their eureka moment. So I think it's time for those of us who are waiting for that to happen first to say, look, we need to actually buckle down and share the principles of many people who are atheists, agnostics, believe in equity, in justice, work 24/7 in order to actualize those. Same with the oneness of humanity. So again, the time for polarization for now is gone. This is the time for us all to pull together and create the systems we need. Now, the systems will eventually probably be enhanced when we also all recognize that, you know what, we are not the be-all and end-all of creation. There is more than us. Maybe there is a divine plan for all of us. Maybe there is a purpose to our individual lives. Maybe there is a purpose to our collective life on this planet. Maybe a loving creator is simply not going to allow us to destroy ourselves, even though we've been making some very poor choices over many years. But there's going to be time for that. And there are many people involved in that work in any event. Again, it's another false dichotomy. We need to be working on both fronts, if you like.
We're running short on time, and I should mention again that sometimes people are raising their hands. The best thing to do is to type in the chat box or the question and answer box, because we're not going to turn on people's microphones and cameras, which I think is what the hand raising allows you to do. Carol makes a very interesting comment that when she lived in the Marshall Islands, often ministers for the government there, when they met, focused on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and how to meet them for the country. So the SDGs were a new way of focusing and determining decisions for coordinating the country's development. And that, of course, is, I think, quite exciting when you have large numbers of countries that need to determine their direction of development, sharing common principles of development, because these goals largely are things like literacy and other very practical goals to achieve. Let's see. One person makes this interesting comment: restrictions on established patterns of production and consumption resulting from the pandemic have allowed air and water quality improvements. How feasible would it be at this moment to encourage global voluntary restrictions on establishing patterns of production and consumption for the long term?
This is a really good question. It's been debated up to a point a lot in the media. So, and basically here's what they say. It's happened before. After 9/11, we saw a drop in the, we stopped flying around so much, and there was a drop in economic activity, although at that time it was 1% of GDP in the US, and this time it's going to be up to 3% already if it goes on till the summer, and so on. But they said what happens is that you have a bounce back effect after that, we try to play catch up. Mm-hmm. And so we go absolutely crazy and end up spewing even more stuff into the air in a bid to catch up on all these months where we were cooped up at home. Now, again, I view this as an opportunity, and this is where we really need to sit back and make smart choices. So instead of another one of these knee-jerk reactions where we go back to business as usual, short-term, with short-term goals in mind, getting the GDP back up, we ask ourselves, and I say to myself, isn't it fascinating? So several things come to my mind. We have just proved to ourselves that we are capable of complete self-discipline to the point of locking ourselves down, which is a pretty severe form of, just stop everything. Don't see your grandmother if you're a grandkid. Don't go out and have fun. Don't get on planes. Don't go to restaurants, etc. Don't go to work. So we can do it. If we can do it for something like a pandemic, are there things that we can think about doing now in order to mitigate climate change instead of waiting until climate change really blows up in our face? I mean, it's already something that is going to cause and has already started causing unbearable disasters. But it's one of those things where, to the extent we're able to mitigate it, we will mitigate the level of disaster that we're courting. Mm-hmm. So yes, what a wonderful realization for all of us to sit back and say, you know what, we can start making, it's not reasonable to be on lockdown. We can't be on lockdown until the climate change problem is resolved. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But we now know that we are capable of resolving these problems. Another question that comes to mind is, if we're capable of locking down an economy, we're capable of stopping war altogether, right? We can lock down war. We can say, that's it, we're done. The Secretary General of the UN called for a ceasefire, but not just a temporary ceasefire. Let's just say, okay, we're done. And all these trillions of dollars that are spent on arms, let's divert them to coming up with renewable sources of energy, for establishing new healthcare systems, for establishing a World Health Organization that actually works and has the capacities, and so on, and for raising people out of poverty and meeting our SDG goals. Mm-hmm. Imagine what's possible. So again, this is an incredible opportunity we have to do things while we still have a choice. Because I hope that one of the things we've learned is, if we don't ourselves make that choice, the universe will present us with the opportunity by forcing us into it, as we have been with the pandemic. Yep. So either we do it voluntarily sooner with less pain, or we wait until we have to and do it with a lot more suffering. This is the choice before us.
Yep. And Ash makes a very interesting comment, which I think echoes exactly what you said. Note that the development of the Sustainable Development Goals involved some years of worldwide consultations with non-governmental organizations, religious bodies and communities, governments, and leaders of thought. Does this not represent a process that could also lead to the agreement on basic principles and the emergence of reformed or new global institutions?
Indeed. Absolutely. Both the process and something else that goes with the process, the trust that is built over the years as these people, because it ends up being the same kinds of people who talk to each other, mm-hmm. and they start to talk across boundaries, across nations, across groups. And the more we talk to each other, the more we break down these limiting beliefs and weird ideas we have about each other that are not based in actual knowledge. They actually stem from ignorance. And as we build these networks of connection, we build the trust. And with every success that we arrive at, we will find that we will gain further successes. So yes, absolutely. All of these are wonderful processes that we can emulate, learn, reflect, right? Learn from what's worked, mm-hmm. look at what hasn't worked, and avoid doing more of that in the future. So there's learning, there's a lot of learning on so many fronts. Absolutely.
Yep. Well, on that note, I think we have the perfect ending for this evening. Perfectly a good example of a principled approach to mm-hmm. something like development as a model for solving other problems in a principled fashion as well. Several people are saying thank you, and this is fantastic. And so you're already receiving great compliments for your presentation tonight, Sovaida, and I will certainly add to those myself. We really are very grateful for your presentation tonight, and we look forward to another one next week, when we'll wrap up this particular series of third of our presentations in the Global Challenges and Opportunities series, and that will then be followed by other speakers as well. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you again, Sovaida. Thank you for the people who have been helping us out. And I wish everyone an excellent good evening, a safe week, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Good night.
Good night. Thank you for coming. Good night.